Rick Ross finally opened his mouth. And the words that fell out may have torched whatever was left of his empire in a single afternoon. For half a year now, 50 Cent has been on a warpath, dragging Ross across every timeline he could find, waving paperwork, screenshotting court filings, and putting Ross's wallet on trial in front of the entire internet like a public execution set to a boom bap soundtrack. And Ross? Complete radio silence. Not a tweet. Not a shrug. Not a wink at the camera. Absolutely nothing. Which, if we're being real, made a lot of listeners quietly wonder if 50 might actually be sitting on the truth this time. Not a rumor this time. Not a bluff. The actual truth. Then the ground shifted. Ross stepped out of the shadows, looked straight into a lens, and finally addressed the money question head-on. And the answer he delivered was the kind of statement that either resurrects a reputation or shovels dirt on the coffin. Right now, hip-hop is standing on both sides of that grave, and nobody agrees on which one just happened. Half the culture thinks Ross just saved himself with one calculated speech. The other half thinks he just fired the bullet that finishes the job 50 Cent has been trying to land for 6 straight months. Both sides are loud. Both sides are convinced. And both sides cannot possibly be right. Because listen, this feud didn't hatch last Tuesday. 50 Cent and Rick Ross have been shooting live rounds at each other for close to 2 decades. Interviews. Diss records. Legal filings. Instagram stories timed like sniper fire. It is one of the longest, ugliest, most theatrical rivalries in the entire history of the genre. And every time the internet convinces itself the fire is dying down, one of them walks over with a fresh can of gasoline. This latest chapter, though, this one hit differently. Because this time, 50 didn't come for the music. He didn't come for the fashion. He didn't come for the flow. He came for the bank statement. And in hip-hop, going after somebody's bank statement is the closest thing to going after their birth certificate. It is not a shot at a song. It is a shot at the identity underneath the song. That is why this round has traveled so far and drawn so much blood. Look at it this way. In rap, being called broke is not an insult. It's an obituary. The entire mythology of this culture is built on the story of the come-up. You rose from nothing, you conquered something, and now you own everything. So when a figure like 50 Cent, a man who has spent the last decade turning himself into a walking case study on empire building, starts openly declaring that one of the biggest names in the entire industry is drowning in red ink, the audience does not scroll past. The audience leans in. Fans start doing forensic accounting in the comment section. Bloggers start pulling records. Podcasters start theorizing. And once that theory sinks its teeth in, no amount of chain flexing gets it back out. The chain only makes the theory louder, because now the chain becomes evidence in the trial. Every luxury item Ross posts becomes Exhibit A for either side, depending on which team you already picked. Ross had to talk. There was no other move on the board. The only remaining question was whether the words he chose would extinguish the wildfire or whether he'd just handed 50 Cent a fresh box of matches. Hold that thought because the answer is uglier than you think. And the fallout from those first sentences Ross spoke is still radiating out into every corner of the culture right now, in ways he almost certainly did not plan for. To understand why Ross's statement carries so much weight, you have to wind the tape back to how the finance narrative was born in the first place. This wasn't just 50 Cent talking on a podcast. Real documents surfaced. Real court filings. Judgments, unpaid bills, sealed rulings that briefly saw daylight. Papers that suggested the boss lifestyle, the private jets, the estate the size of a small town, the Wingstop empire, might have been leveraged so aggressively that the balance sheet was closer to a house of cards than a house on a hill. And 50 Cent, being 50 Cent, pounced on that paperwork like a man who had been waiting for exactly this envelope to arrive in his mailbox. Because honestly, he had. He had been rehearsing this exact moment for a decade. He had been sharpening this knife since before half the current audience even knew who Rick Ross was. 50 Cent has spent years perfecting a very specific style of combat. He doesn't just insult somebody. He researches them. He locates the exact bruise on the opponent's public image, presses his thumb into it, and refuses to let go until the entire room is watching. He did it to Ja Rule. He did it to Diddy. He did it to the power showrunners. He did it to his own bloodline. When 50 Cent zeroes in on a target, he does not shoot once and leave. He camps out. He builds a full campaign around the wound. And every 24 hours, he pours another gallon of accelerant onto the same spot. That is the pattern. That is the method. That is the reason people who go to war with 50 Cent usually come out of the war looking smaller than when they went in, whether or not they were technically right about the facts. And this campaign was working. Loudly. Comment sections turned into courtrooms. Blogs stopped covering the beef as gossip and started covering it as business news. Every clip 50 posted stacked view counts. Every meme he made became a lifted joke on group chats. Talk shows had segments. Barbershops had debates. Fans who used to defend Ross out of habit began to hesitate. And every single hour that Ross refused to say anything, the theory grew a little more roots. In the old days, silence used to be regal. Silence used to be the flex. You didn't respond to the noise because you were above the noise. But the algorithm changed the meaning of silence. In 2026, silence is not dignity. Silence is a confession, whether you like it or not. If you don't defend yourself in this new arena, the internet writes your defense for you, and it writes it in ways you will not enjoy. The internet always writes the worst possible version. That is what the internet does when you leave it alone with your reputation. Ross figured that out. Eventually. Whether he moved at the right beat or whether he let the clock run down a fraction too long, that is a debate that will keep hip-hop podcasters employed for months. Because when the response finally arrived, it arrived hot, it arrived layered, and it arrived carrying baggage nobody expected. Rick Ross clapped back at 50 Cent. Rick Ross clapped back at Uncle Murda. Rick Ross clapped back at anybody who had a microphone within 100 yards of the story. And he did not pull the punch. He came out with the tone of a man who had been counting the hours until he could finally speak, and the moment the muzzle came off, everything he had been holding back for months came flying out at once. Some of it was sharp. Some of it was smart. And some of it was the kind of thing you say in a moment of pressure that you regret 2 days later when the internet has archived it forever. The trigger that finally cracked the silence, interestingly enough, wasn't even 50 Cent this time. It was a viral photograph. A grainy shot of what appeared to be Rick Ross sitting alone in a foreign airport, no security detail visible, no glam squad, no assistant hovering nearby, waiting on a commercial flight like any other mortal. Uncle Murda amplified it. The internet dissected it frame by frame. Suddenly, the boss looked less like a boss and more like a passenger stuck at gate C14 hoping the Wi-Fi worked. And that image, more than any lawsuit, more than any court filing, was the flint that finally struck steel inside Ross. One picture ended a 6-month silence. That is how much imagery matters to a man like Ross. He can walk past a stack of legal filings without flinching. But show him a picture of himself looking ordinary, and the microphone comes on within 24 hours. Because Ross knows exactly how imagery works. His entire brand is imagery. Ross does not sell songs. Ross sells lifestyle. Ross sells the idea that if you grind long enough and hard enough, you too can own an estate large enough to require a fleet of tractors. And when a picture cuts against that story, the picture is not just a picture. The picture is a threat to the entire product. So when Ross finally walked in front of a camera, he came swinging at every angle of that photograph simultaneously. He wanted to erase the image from the timeline. And in the process of trying to erase it, he made it 3 times more famous. Because that is how these things always go. The moment you attack the picture goes on tour. He said the private jet was in the shop. Fine. He said it was getting Starlink installed. Fancy. He said he chose to fly commercial because he was headed to Colombia to link up with Trick Daddy and party. Whatever. But then he said something that pulled the whole speech sideways. He said nobody should ever look down on a young hustler moving through an airport, because he himself flew commercial for 20 solid years before he ever chartered a jet. That line was designed to sound humble. It landed a little differently. Because in the middle of defending his boss image, he'd accidentally reminded the audience of exactly how long the road behind him actually was, and how visible any slip backward would be. It was the kind of line that plays great in a documentary and plays terribly in a defense speech. Ross was giving the audience the origin story when the audience was asking about the current chapter. Then he turned the volume up. Ross went straight at the paperwork. He didn't dodge the court documents. He didn't pretend they were fabricated. Instead, he argued that they were being read wrong. He argued that anyone who genuinely understood how wealth functions at his tier would understand that debts in business are tools, not tombstones. That leveraging a portfolio is not the same as burning through a bank account. That a balance sheet that looks scary to a civilian is often the balance sheet of a person quietly compounding a fortune. And to be fair, Ross was not entirely wrong there. That is genuinely how big money works. Real estate empires run on debt. Restaurant chains run on debt. Entertainment ventures run on debt. If you looked at the paperwork behind almost any billionaire in America, half of it would look apocalyptic if you didn't know how to read it. The problem is not that Ross made the argument. The problem is that he made the argument for exactly one paragraph before he lost the discipline to stay with it. But here is where the argument started bleeding out. Ross made the intellectual case for one paragraph and then abandoned it. Instead of walking the audience through a single concrete number, instead of showing one signed statement from an accountant, instead of putting one specific asset on camera with documentation, he retreated to a comfort zone. He started flexing. He talked about his mansion. He talked about his cars. He talked about his portfolio in the vaguest possible terms, using words like massive and empire and generational without ever attaching a decimal point to anything. And when you are trying to disprove a very specific financial claim, vibes are not evidence. Vibes are what people who cannot show evidence use instead of evidence. The internet clocked that instantly. And once the internet clocks a rhetorical dodge, the internet does not forget it. It becomes a supercut. It becomes a meme. It becomes a running joke that follows the artist into every future interview until the sun explodes. Twitter noticed. Instagram noticed. Reddit noticed with academic precision, because Reddit always does. People began pointing out, correctly, that owning something and displaying something are not the same activity. Anyone can lease a Rolls-Royce. Anyone can rent a mansion for an afternoon photo shoot. Anyone can stand in front of somebody else's yacht. What separates the mythology from the ledger is documentation. And documentation was the exact thing Ross would not put on the table. Not couldn't. Would not. That distinction became the whole conversation. Because if the paperwork existed and looked fine, showing it would have taken about 11 seconds. And those 11 seconds have not happened. 50 Cent, of course, was watching every second of this unfold in real time. And 50 Cent does not miss a window. Within hours, he was back on the timeline, this time with a smirk instead of a scowl. Because here is the thing that so many of 50's opponents underestimate. 50 Cent is not just a fighter. 50 Cent is a showman. He does not simply attack. He performs the attack. He turns every clash into a limited series drama with cliffhangers and running gags and characters. And the audience, even the audience that claims to hate him, cannot look away, because the show is genuinely well produced. He posted clips. He layered captions. He built photo grids. He recorded voice memos. He made memes about the mowing tractor. He made memes about the airport photo. He made memes about the Starlink line. And every one of those posts stacked engagement while Ross was still typing his next serious paragraph. 50 Cent was speaking in headlines. Ross was speaking in essays. And the headlines were beating the essays by a margin that was almost embarrassing. That is the asymmetry that has made 50 Cent one of the most dangerous public opponents alive. If you fight him with logic, he responds with comedy. If you fight him with comedy, he responds with paperwork. If you fight him with paperwork, he responds with cinema. You cannot pin him down long enough to land a clean shot, because he keeps changing the game while the other side is still setting up the board. This is not luck. This is not accident. This is a 2-decade craft. 50 Cent studies public warfare the way generals study battles. And Rick Ross, unfortunately, walked into a war of narrative with an opponent who literally teaches the class. Meanwhile, Ross was trying to switch strategies. He pivoted from defense to legacy mode. He started talking about Wingstop. He started talking about the real estate holdings scattered across Atlanta. He started talking about Maybach Music Group and the artists he had personally lifted out of anonymity. His argument, essentially, became, don't let one man rewrite the story of everything I have ever built. On paper, that pivot was strategic. Highlight reels are compelling. Legacy talk works. In practice, though, pivoting to your greatest hits when the audience is asking about last month's bank statement reads as evasion. It reads as a magician waving one hand while trying to hide the other. Viewers were not there for a career retrospective. Viewers were there for the receipts. And every paragraph Ross spent not producing receipts felt, subtly, like a paragraph confirming that receipts might not exist. That may not be fair. But that is how the audience read it. And the audience is the judge in this genre. Always. 50 Cent walked right into that gap and started rearranging the furniture. He kept it simple. He kept looping back to the same question. Show us the proof. If everything is beautiful, show us the paperwork. If the empire is intact, show us the ledger. Simple. Repetitive. Devastating. Because 50 Cent has learned something most public feuders never learn, a single sharp question, repeated calmly for weeks, does more damage than 1,000 angry paragraphs. Ross was writing essays. 50 Cent was writing headlines. The headlines were winning. And every time Ross tried to answer with volume, 50 answered with a single line that fit inside a screenshot. The screenshots always beat the paragraphs. That is how information moves now. And then the professionals stepped in. Not the fans. Not the podcasters. The actual industry. Executives began whispering. Managers began texting. Sponsors began doing what sponsors always do when a headline is on fire. They began quietly reviewing their exposure. That is the part that people outside the business never fully appreciate. In hip-hop, the public perception and the private balance sheet are not separate. They are the same instrument. If the internet is convinced you are broke, potential partners will hear the same rumor. They will not say it out loud. They will simply take a little longer to return your call. They will simply require a slightly deeper conversation before signing. That is not a career ending. That is a career slowing down. And a slowing career is sometimes worse than an ending one because it happens in slow motion, in front of everyone. You do not get the drama of a collapse. You get the quiet indignity of a slow leak. Ross seemed to understand the stakes were climbing. He recalibrated. He booked more podcast appearances. He sat down with journalists. His tone softened. He became less bombastic and more strategic. He tried to remind people of the entire body of work, the music, the food, the fashion-adjacent plays, the mentorships. He wanted the conversation to zoom out. Some of the audience was willing to zoom out with him. A lot of them were not. Because the more Ross talked, the more one habit became impossible to ignore. He was fluent in describing his wealth generally, and he was allergic to describing his wealth specifically. There was no accountant. There was no auditor. There was no independent voice standing next to him verifying anything. It was Ross's word, delivered eloquently, against a stack of court filings that were, unfortunately, part of the public record. In court, a man's word against paper usually loses. The internet works exactly the same way, only faster and with more emojis. Then the tone of the conversation shifted from an unexpected direction. Not everybody in the media was buying the 50 Cent version of the story either. A handful of commentators started pushing back on his angle, questioning whether he was really doing this because he cared about transparency in the culture, or whether he was doing it because it worked. Because tearing Ross down publicly kept 50 Cent's own name on the front page. Because generating this specific type of controversy was, at this stage of his career, a business model. And that critique landed harder than many people expected. It gave Ross a small window, an inch of daylight in a wall that had felt airtight for months. But he had to move fast to use it. And moving fast has never been Rick Ross's strong suit. Because it is a fair critique. 50 Cent's entire modern persona is built on being the man who calls people out. The power universe made him a legitimate television mogul, but the algorithmic energy that keeps him relevant with the 20-something audience does not come from television. It comes from the posts. The memes. The reactions. The public warfare. Without a target, 50 Cent is a wealthy executive with a beard. With a target, 50 Cent is must-watch content. And Ross, whether he signed up for the role or not, has been the most valuable recurring co-star in 50 Cent's cinematic universe for the better part of 20 years. If 50 Cent is the villain in his own show, Rick Ross has been the guest star he keeps inviting back for Sweeps Week. That is not a compliment or an insult. That is just how the ecosystem works. Ross tried to walk that fine line in a couple of longer sit-downs. He acknowledged that 50 had a motive. He argued that motive did not equal accuracy. He said, more or less, that a man can be self-interested and correct at the same time, and that the audience should separate the messenger from the message. Which, again, was actually a sharp and mature point. Nuanced. Adult. Grown man rap. The problem is that nuance and social media do not share a zip code. The internet does not carry nuance. The internet carries the headline version of the story. And the headline was still not flattering to Ross. In the headline, Ross was on defense. In the headline, 50 Cent was on offense. And headlines are what most of the audience actually reads. So Ross made a decision that stunned pretty much everybody who had been tracking the beef closely. He went straight at 50 Cent's business record. He stopped playing defense and started playing offense. He questioned whether 50 Cent's empire was really as bulletproof as it looked from the outside. He mentioned deals that had gone quiet. He mentioned partnerships that had unraveled. He suggested that the man wagging the finger might have his own dust bunnies under the couch when it came to money. On paper, this was the move a strategist would recommend. In reality, it was a landmine. It was a bold move. Bold. And also, badly aimed. Because 50 Cent had already inoculated himself against exactly this attack years ago. 50 Cent's bankruptcy is not a secret. 50 Cent was not hiding from it. 50 Cent monetized it. He wrote about it. He joked about it on television. He turned it into a chapter of the redemption arc that half of business Twitter now references when they talk about comeback stories. So when Ross tried to pull that grenade out of the crate, it detonated in his own hand. There was nothing left to expose. There was no leverage there. 50 Cent had spent years volunteering the information that Ross was trying to weaponize. You cannot ambush a man who has been standing in the open the whole time. Ross swung at empty air, and the swing looked worse than no swing at all would have. 50 Cent's response was cold and short and devastating. He laughed. He reminded people that he had been transparent about his own numbers the whole time. And then he redirected the conversation back to the one question that Ross still had not answered. Where are your receipts? Where is the proof? Where is the paperwork? Simple. Loud. And unfortunately for Ross, still unanswered. The internet agreed. Even Ross's most loyal listeners, the ones who had been showing up for him for a decade, quietly admitted the counterattack had swung wide and missed clean. Some of them started to wonder, in their own private group chats, whether the paperwork existed at all. That is the moment a story goes from a headline to a hangover. Ross was running low on clean angles. Every direction he moved seemed to hatch new questions instead of answering old ones. The skeptics grew more skeptical. The neutral observers began drifting toward skepticism. Even some of the die-hard supporters, the loyalists, the ones who had gone to bat for Ross for years, started softening their tone in group chats. The storyline was cementing around him, and it was not cementing in a friendly shape. It was cementing into the exact shape 50 Cent had been sketching for months. Which is the nightmare scenario for anybody fighting a narrative war. The moment the audience starts hearing the story in the opponent's voice inside their own head, the fight is functionally over. Everything after that is just cleanup. But then something unexpected happened. The conversation grew larger than the two men at the center of it. Hip-hop, as a culture, started using this moment as a doorway into a much bigger conversation about wealth, image, and what any of it actually means in this industry. Think pieces started dropping. Podcasts devoted full episodes to it. Financial literacy creators, of all people, began pulling the court documents themselves, walking through them frame by frame in plain English on YouTube and TikTok. Some of those breakdowns did not land as brutally on Ross as 50 Cent's framing had suggested. A few of those analysts pointed out that the debts in question were tied to very specific business ventures and legal disputes, and that they did not by themselves indicate a person collapsing into poverty. They walked viewers through the difference between personal wealth and business liability with actual patience, which almost never happens on the internet. And for the first time in this whole cycle, Ross's original argument found a friendly audience. The nuance that had gotten steamrolled on social media suddenly found a home in longer-form content. And Ross, thankfully, had the presence of mind to recognize what was happening. Instead of putting himself back in front of a camera and saying it himself, he did something quieter. He amplified the voices already saying it. He shared the breakdowns. He reposted the analyses. He essentially let third parties make the case that he had been unable to make for himself. And that was, honestly, the smartest thing he did in this entire cycle. Because when a neutral voice explains why you are being misread, the explanation carries weight the defendant's own voice never can. A defense from a stranger sounds like a verdict. A defense from yourself sounds like an alibi. 50 Cent noticed the shift. He didn't love it. He tried to keep the temperature high, kept the memes rolling, kept the jabs stacking. But the temperature was starting to lower on its own. Not because Ross had won anything decisively, he hadn't, but because the audience was drifting into what podcasters call beef fatigue. There is a shelf life to every drama, no matter how well produced. Even the greatest sports rivalries have to sit out a season. Even the loudest political showdowns get quiet news weeks. And the Ross vs 50 Cent cycle was hitting the point where a segment of the audience wanted a resolution or a break. Not because they had stopped caring, but because the loop had run its full cycle and they were waiting to see whether either man could push the story into a new act. The real question now was whether Ross could use the cooling window to properly rehabilitate the story around his name, or whether the damage was already deep enough that a few good podcast hits and shared explainers were not going to patch it. That answer was starting to take shape. And it was, as always with Rick Ross, complicated. Which brings us to the part of the story that most people are getting wrong. Because here is where things actually stand. Rick Ross did not lose this cycle the way everybody assumed he would. When 50 Cent first started pushing the broke narrative, most of the audience predicted one of two outcomes. Either Ross would stay silent until the story consumed him, or Ross would break silence and embarrass himself so badly that 50 Cent would win a knockout on the highlight reel. Ross did neither of those things all the way. What Ross actually did was messier and more human. He fumbled. He recovered. He fumbled again. He recovered again. He tried 5 different responses in 5 different tones across 5 different weeks. Some of them worked. Some of them didn't. All of them looked like a man doing what actual humans do when they are cornered in public, improvising in real time while the entire internet grades every syllable. Which is either sympathetic or embarrassing depending on how much of Ross's music you happen to enjoy. 50 Cent, on the other hand, did exactly what 50 Cent always does in these moments. He looked composed. He looked entertained. He looked like a man playing a video game he had already beaten 100 times. Because in a way, he had. He has been doing exactly this, publicly disassembling somebody in slow motion, since Ja Rule was a household name. He knows every beat. He knows when to escalate. He knows when to soften. He knows when to hand the microphone to a meme and let the meme do the killing. That is either a compliment or an indictment depending on how you feel about him, and it is probably both. There is a level of practiced cruelty in 50 Cent's approach that is almost impressive from a distance and almost unbearable if you are the person on the receiving end. What this cycle actually exposed, if we are being honest, is a truth hip-hop has always circled around and rarely landed on. The distance between the image of wealth and the reality of wealth in this industry is huge. And it exists on both sides of this feud. The culture rewards the appearance of success so aggressively that separating the performance from the balance sheet becomes almost impossible from the audience's angle. Ross built a career on abundance. Big cars, big estates, big meals, big everything. And 50 Cent built a career on seeing through exactly that kind of production. So when these two men collide on a topic like this, what the audience is actually watching is two competing versions of hip-hop mythology throwing hands with each other. And neither of them walks off the field spotless. Both of them leave with mud on the shoes. Both of them leave with something to explain to the accountant later. At the end of all of it, this feud is not really about Rick Ross. It is not really about 50 Cent either. It is a spotlight aimed at the culture itself. It is a spotlight on how hip-hop packages success, sells that packaging to a global audience, and then sometimes consumes the people who cannot always live up to what was packaged. Ross got caught inside that machine this year. 50 Cent knew how to run the controls. And the audience watched every second of it in real time because, honestly, it was impossible to look away. The whole cycle was a masterclass in how modern narratives get built and how they get demolished, delivered by two men who have been at war with each other longer than some of the current audience has been alive. Whether Ross walks out of this with his reputation intact is still an open file. He absorbed damage. That is not up for discussion. But he is also still standing. Still touring. Still cutting checks. still in the conversation. In this industry, staying inside the conversation is half the battle, and love him or fault him, this whole storm kept Ross's name in the center of the culture for months. That has value too, even when the value comes with scars. Attention is currency in this economy. And nobody, not even 50 Cent, gave Ross more free attention this year than Ross's biggest supposed enemy did. 50 Cent won the individual rounds. That is fair to say. He landed the jokes. He landed the memes. He landed the paperwork moment. He owned the news cycles. He owned the timelines. If you scored this like a boxing match, 50 Cent walked away with the belt on points. But whether Rick Ross survives the bigger story, the year-long story, the decade-long story, the mythology story, is a question that only the calendar is qualified to answer. Hip-hop has seen bigger stars fall from higher perches and climb back. Hip-hop has also seen careers dented by exactly this kind of controversy in ways that never fully heal. Which one is this? Nobody knows yet. Not even Ross. Not even 50 Cent. The people who talk the loudest about this beef are usually the people who know the least about how it actually ends. There is one more piece of this to sit with. And it may be the piece that outlasts every joke, every meme, every court document. This feud, at its heart, is a warning shot to every artist in the culture watching from the sidelines. It is a warning that the era of curated luxury may be shifting. It is a warning that the audience is getting sharper, that the algorithm rewards receipts, that the myths cannot survive on gloss alone anymore. Every rapper posting a rented Bugatti this week is watching Rick Ross and quietly recalculating. Every executive who has been selling a lifestyle they cannot actually afford is watching this and wondering when their turn will come. This is bigger than a beef. This is a temperature check on an entire era. And the reading on that thermometer is climbing every week. And that is why the story keeps refusing to die. It is not because two men are yelling. Men have been yelling in hip-hop since the beginning. It is because the yelling is pointing at something the audience has secretly wanted to talk about for years. What does wealth actually mean in a genre that was built on lying about having it, then telling the truth about having it, then lying again? Ross and 50 Cent are just the two loudest voices in a room full of quiet listeners. Everybody in that room has a stake in how this ends. And everybody in that room is quietly deciding, without saying it out loud, whether the mythology they have been buying for 20 years is still worth the price. That is why the story keeps expanding. Because the more people talk about Rick Ross, the more they are actually talking about themselves. About the version of success they were sold. About the version of success they are still trying to sell. About the version of success they suspect might not survive the next audit. Ross is not just a rapper going through a moment. Ross has become an accidental mirror, and the entire culture is looking into that mirror whether it wants to or not. Some are laughing at what they see. Some are getting nervous. Some are quietly pulling their own paperwork out of the drawer to double-check the numbers before somebody else does it for them on Twitter. Meanwhile, 50 Cent has already begun teasing the next chapter. Because of course he has. This is what he does. He does not close arcs. He extends them. He plants a hint. He waits 3 days. He posts a fresh receipt. He drops a caption that gets 100,000 comments. He keeps the show on the air. And every time you think you have seen the finale, another episode drops on his timeline. If Ross thought this was the last round, he was reading the wrong script. 50 Cent is not writing a movie. 50 Cent is writing a series. And the series does not end until 50 Cent personally decides the ratings have dipped low enough to justify a cancellation. So the question we throw to you, the one that will not resolve itself in a highlight reel, is this. Do you believe Rick Ross when he says the paperwork does not tell the real story? Or do you believe 50 Cent when he says the paperwork tells the only story? Drop your verdict in the comments. Do not be shy. Because the internet is watching, and the algorithm is listening, and the next chapter of this saga is already loading in the background.